Hello everyone, this is AndresRestart, and we might finally know what is going on with Metroid Prime 4 Beyond. When will we next be hearing about this game from Nintendo in some sort of major way? What's going on with Metroid Prime 2 and 3 Remastered? Are we going to see these games before Prime 4 comes out? And when exactly is Metroid Prime 4 coming out? All they've told us is it's coming out in this year of 2025, but recently there's been this advertising going out saying the game is out now. Now, this is not true, it is not out now, but it does have us wondering, what is going on with Metroid Prime 4 Beyond here? Well, it looks like enough pieces are finally coming together to paint a compelling picture for how Nintendo's going to be handling this game this year. And I'm actually thinking it's going to be a pretty fun, exciting campaign all the way up until release, and then hopefully beyond as well. So that's what we're getting into this time. But before going forward, let me point out I'm aiming for a goal of 60,000 subscribers. So if you find yourself enjoying my content, your subscription would be appreciated. So I'm going to be splitting up this conversation into a few parts here. First, we're going to talk about when we're going to get the next bit of news on this game, and then we'll be getting into if they're saving some sort of major presentation for Metroid Prime 4 even after perhaps the next major direct. And then we'll get into the Metroid Prime 2 and 3 situation, and we'll close out with discussion on when exactly Prime 4 could be coming out here. So first, when are we going to see the next bit of news on Metroid Prime 4? Like the next trailer where they'll tell us a little bit more about the game, perhaps really start to sell us on the game, and also provide a release date on the game so we know when it's coming out this year, and hopefully by that point we can feel confident that there will be no delays. Well, I'm thinking that time is actually coming fairly soon, in the next Nintendo Direct. Now, we did just get a Donkey Kong Bonanza Direct, but a Donkey Kong Bonanza Direct is a game-specific Direct, and I don't think a game-specific Direct takes away from the likelihood of a big general. We have seen game-specific Directs come out shortly before a major Nintendo Direct, like the Splatoon 3 Direct or the Mario Wonder Direct. And really, in my opinion, I don't think game-specific Directs have much bearing on when we're going to see the next big Nintendo Direct. I think ultimately what it comes down to for when we get to see these next big Nintendo Directs is if there's reason to put out these presentations. And I actually think there's quite a bit of reason to put out a major presentation. One, we need release dates and updates on a variety of first-party games that are slated for this year, including Metroid Prime 4. Two, we went through Summer Games Fest without any sort of major third-party announcements for Switch 2, but there are going to be third-party games continually coming to Switch 2, a great deal of them, and so when are those announcements going to happen? We went through all the early June events where a whole bunch of different announcements were made for the gaming industry, but not many were made for the Switch 2. Of course, the Switch 2 had just come out, but point is, we need to get those third-party announcements. And so there's going to be third-party announcements, likely in a Direct in the not-so-distant future, I think. And then on top of both of those things, I also believe that there needs to be at least one, maybe two more announcements for this year from Nintendo, and so all of that would definitely make sense for there to be a big general presentation. Perhaps Nintendo's waiting a little bit later than usual to have a big general direct for the summer, but I still think it's happening and I still expect it to happen before Donkey Kong Bonanza comes out in later July. And what's interesting about the timing there is that Bonanza right now is getting the big brunt of Nintendo's marketing, right? Right now we're learning everything about Donkey Kong Bonanza. Donkey Kong is in the spotlight, and a few weeks ago when we were approaching the release of Switch 2, it was Mario Kart World. But what happens after Bonanza? Then there's going to be another game that Nintendo will push into the spotlight, and I think there's a really good chance that's going to be Metroid Prime 4. And even if it's not Metroid Prime 4, let's say something else comes out in between, eventually Metroid Prime 4 is going to take that spotlight. Which brings me to my next point here. I actually think there's a pretty good chance there is going to be a Metroid Prime 4 Beyond Nintendo Direct. So, something I noticed back in 2017, and I've talked about this before, I actually put out a theory video a month or so ago, that there are going to be more game-specific Nintendo Directs this year than usual. As you see here, in 2017, there were technically 5 game-specific Nintendo Directs. A Fire Emblem Direct, an ARMS Direct, a Splatoon 2 Direct, an Animal Crossing Mobile Direct, and a Xenoblade Chronicles 2 Direct. Now, yes, 2 of those 5 games were not for Switch 1, but there were still 3 major game-specific Nintendo Directs alongside major Nintendo Direct presentations like this one in September and this one in April, and this does not even include the Summer Showcase because it technically wasn't a Direct, which is why you don't see it on this page here, in June of that year, and then also there was the big Switch 1 opening press conference in January. So Nintendo, in 2017, when they launched the Switch 1 in March, they had 4 major general presentations and 5 game-specific Nintendo Directs, and 3 of those 5 were for big brand new Switch 1 titles. And so looking at this year so far, we are starting to see something very similar. We've already gotten 2 big presentations, the March Nintendo Direct for Switch 1, the April Nintendo Direct, the first one for Switch 2, and we've gotten a game-specific Direct for Mario Kart World and Donkey Kong Bonanza. I think we're probably going to get at least 1 more game-specific Direct for this year, and there's probably going to be at least 2 more Nintendo Direct presentations. One for the summer, as I was just talking about, and likely one for later in the year, September, where they usually have those types of presentations. And so similar to how I was thinking we would be getting a Donkey Kong Bonanza Direct, and that materialized, I am also thinking there will be a Metroid Prime 4 Direct. Now, with Metroid Prime 4, it might not be as likely as Donkey Kong, but just considering what we know about for this year, if I have to take my pick for the games that we already know about coming from Nintendo for this year, if there's going to be at least 1 more game-specific Direct, it would be for Metroid Prime 4, but like I said in 2017, they technically had 5 game-specific Directs. Yes, some of those weren't for Switch 1, but with the way Nintendo's handling things now, how all Switch 1 games are also on Switch 2, I could see a scenario where there are more than 3 game-specific Directs, and oh, by the way, technically Metroid Prime 4 is a Switch 1 title with a Switch 2 edition. Point is, I think it's likely that we could be seeing a big Direct for Prime 4 similar to what we just got for Donkey Kong Bonanza, where Metroid Prime 4 will all of a sudden show the world that it's worth consideration as well, and people will be talking about how maybe this game could be a Game of the Year candidate, just like how people are talking about it for Donkey Kong Bonanza. And something else I'll mention that just occurred to me that I think is interesting and might help to very, very slightly support this idea, is that just like Bonanza, with Prime 4, there has only been a focus on the first 2 areas of the game right now. We've barely seen the game. But then with a big game-specific Direct, they provided us a big blowout. So they may have a similar plan with Prime 4 as they do with Bonanza. But something else important to consider here when it comes to marketing for Metroid Prime 4 is how Nintendo's going to handle the releases for Metroid Prime 2 and 3. Now, some people are just thinking that Nintendo's given up on these games. I do not think that Nintendo has given up on these games. I purely think it's a matter of timing. Metroid Prime 4 has not come out yet, and so they have not put out Metroid Prime 2 or 3. These games have been rumored from credible places for years already, and the only reason I think we haven't seen them is because Metroid Prime 4 has taken longer to come out than expected, and I think there's a few reasons for that actually. And I'll speak more on that element in a moment here, but just focusing on Metroid Prime 2 and 3, I think what's going to happen is that closer to release, we'll see these games come out similar to how Nintendo put out Pikmin 1 and 2 right before the release of Pikmin 4. There was already the Pikmin 3 Deluxe that people were able to enjoy for some time, similar to how we've been able to enjoy Metroid Prime Remastered for a little while. I think this is kind of how they are going to handle it. And there's actually something that just happened that's giving me a bit more confidence about Metroid Prime 2 and 3 happening in this way. So, stick with me here. At first you might be, what are you talking about? But just hear me out. We just got word that the developers of Liza P, Round 8 Studio, they did extremely well with the game. They sold over 3 million copies, their DLC has done really well, and so their publisher, NeoWiz, has rewarded them with a whole bunch of Switch 2s, launch bonuses, and an extra 2 weeks of paid vacation. That's quite a reward for a successful game. But you might be wondering, how is this at all related to Metroid Prime 2 and 3, Nintendo, and the Switch 2? Liza P isn't available for Switch 1 or Switch 2. Well, the reason why this is interesting is because they just awarded all these devs a whole bunch of Nintendo Switch 2s. Why would you do that if you had no interest in developing for the console? To be clear, this does not confirm that Lies of P is coming to Nintendo Switch 2, but it does suggest that it is a likelihood though. And considering the game and what it's been able to run on, I don't think that's really a stretch at all. And the reason I find this increasingly more interesting is that it now supports the idea of Lies of P coming to Switch 2 even more so, which brings me back to a rumor on Lies of P from Nash Weedle a few weeks ago back in May, where he said that Lies of P is in development for Nintendo Switch 2, and then a few weeks later, we see that they buy a whole bunch of Switch 2s for the development team. I think it's a very curious thing that's going on here. And so, what's interesting about Nash Weedle, if you haven't been paying attention, is that we keep learning about more and more of his leaks coming true. The list is ever growing. The No Man's Sky Switch 2 edition that was for free, the mouse controls in Metroid Prime 4, the Targe edition of Elden Ring, and so on. There's so much. This is just one more thing that he has gotten right, and at this point I'm expecting more to come to fruition as well. And so the reason this is relevant though is because Nash Weedle has told us about what is going on with Metroid Prime 2 and 3. I've brought this podcast up a few times over the last few weeks, but friend of the channel Attack the Backlog conducted an interview or a discussion with Nash Weedle, and in this discussion a variety of interesting things were said, including an implication that Metroid Prime 2 and 3 look to be announced on the Nintendo Today app. And so given how much Nash Weedle has gone right lately, I'm very inclined to believe them. I also think it makes sense. We've already seen Nintendo put out some announcements in the Today app, and I could see something like a Metroid Prime 2 and 3 not really needing to be in a Nintendo Direct, but being announcement on the Today app makes a lot of sense. These wouldn't be like big Switch 2 announcements, right? I assume the big Nintendo Directs we'll see later this year are going to have to do with major news for new Switch 2 titles or big Switch 2 editions. Metroid Prime 2 and 3, I'm not even expecting to be significant remasters. Minor remasterings, similar to Pikmin 1 and 2, but will be made available for everyone to play on their Switch 1s, and of course also by extension, Switch 2. And given how long we've waited for these games, I think at this point it is safe to say that if they are coming, it's because they are saving them close to the release of Metroid Prime 4. So then, when is this release of Metroid Prime 4? As I mentioned before, there's this advertisement in London that says that Metroid Prime 4 is out now. This is not true, but it does have me wondering, why did this mistake happen? Is it purely just an error where they had the Mario Kart World advertisement and they just accidentally took that out now part from Mario Kart World and slapped it onto Metroid Prime 4 as well, and that's all it is? That is absolutely a possibility, and perhaps the most likely possibility. But it does take me back to something that we considered before we knew about the overall launch lineup for Switch 2, and that's that maybe Metroid Prime 4 could have been a launch title for Switch 2. A lot of us were thinking it, debating it, maybe not the main game, but a part of the overall package. There was a lot of speculation that perhaps the big 1-2 punch would have been Mario Kart World and Metroid Prime 4. Now, instead of that, what we got is Mario Kart World, and then Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom Switch 2 editions, and also the Nintendo Switch 2 Welcome Tour on the eShop. And ultimately, I think this is a fine launch lineup, especially with Bonanza about to come out, as long as Nintendo continues to put out bangers month by month consistently, and perhaps even more given it is the launch year. I think it's totally fine. But I think this is an interesting consideration, especially when we also factor in that the Metroid Prime retrospective art book was initially slated to come out in June, which might have made sense to put out if you have some Metroid Prime releases coming out in June. And maybe that could have just been Metroid Prime 2 and 3 in the launch month of Switch 2, and Metroid Prime 4 would have been a bit later, but it does have me thinking that maybe there was some kind of plan for Metroid releases in June, in the launch month of Switch 2, and things got pushed back because now the art book is actually slated for October 28th, which I also find to be a very, very curious date here. Why do I find it curious? Well, because Pokemon Legends EA is coming out October 16th, and you might be thinking, okay, there's already a major game coming out in October, what would that have to do with Metroid? Well, the thing is, I don't think we should be assuming it's only going to be one major release per month here. That's not actually how Nintendo operates. Now, I do think in general, it's a solid rule of thumb to just kind of assume that we'll get about one major game per month, but it's going to vary. And when we're talking about the launch year of a new console, that's a time where you're going to see more game releases, and if we look at several years during the Switch 1 era, or just in general throughout Nintendo history, when we're talking about the October to December period, there tends to be more than just one major release per month, there's usually more. Now in prior generations, Nintendo had to juggle multiple platforms, and so there were different games coming out for different platforms, but even during the Switch era, we saw months where there were multiple major releases coming out in the same month, such as Mario Party and Metroid Dread back in 2021 coming out in the same month. That's just one of a few examples. And so coming back to Pokemon Legends Yay coming out mid-October, it's coming out early enough in October that 2 weeks later, that Thursday, October 30th, is right before Halloween. That's enough time to put out another major game that might make sense to come out alongside that whole Halloween celebration timing. We've seen Nintendo do this a few times with a few different games, including Luigi's Mansion, and I've been theorizing that maybe we see Luigi's Mansion 4 as a big surprise title for this year. But trying to pull away from my bias a bit here, Metroid also makes sense as a Halloween-ish related release, and 2 weeks removed from Pokemon might actually not be the worst idea. It's enough time where you could focus on another title, and if you have this Metroid Prime retrospective art book coming out October 28th, that all may coincide. Now, maybe instead what we see is Metroid Prime 2 and 3 coming out late October, and in November is when we see Metroid Prime 4 come out as the big November release, because we still don't know about what's coming out in November, and still there could be another major release for November and also for October, but it is interesting to consider that this art book has been pushed all the way back to late October here, where we do have an interesting window of time where it would make sense to put out another major release. Personally, I would like to think that Metroid Prime 4 is coming out this September, but there is no real evidence to support that idea just beyond it making sense and kind of considering how much we know about this game in comparison to other things. It seems like Nintendo would put it out before Pokemon and would save something else for the later holiday period, another big release. Although some people think there are no other big releases and what we have is what we have and that's it. It's also possible the art book doesn't really tell us much about when a Metroid game is coming out, because they can always put an art book afterwards for people to celebrate that, and they may have delayed it for some other reason, but considering that it's an art book, I do wonder why they would have delayed it for so many months. Would it really have required that much extra work to get it completed? I feel like this would have been delayed for marketing reasons, and if it's for marketing reasons, I do think that ties into some kind of release here, so I actually do think that something is going on with this. But just because it's coming out in October still doesn't necessarily mean that Prime 4 is coming out in October and November. They still may want the art book to come out afterwards or beforehand. We're not quite sure what their thinking is here, but there is one more interesting thing I've noticed here that I think is probably relevant. And that's that little banner that we saw for Prime 4 that shows it as out now in London, it also has a rating for PEGI 12. And so this is interesting because pre-Switch 2 Direct, there was no ratings for Prime 4, and so this led some people to believe that perhaps it's that far off and we won't be getting a date, but now it looks like the game has been rated in some regions. And so, going into the next Direct, I think there's a very good chance we'll be getting a release date. Does that mean that this game will be coming out earlier than October? I would say it's tough to say for certain because we've seen games rated well in advance before, so it doesn't necessarily mean it's coming out sooner than later. You also could spin this in the opposite direction now, because since the game has been rated, they may know when the game is coming out, and perhaps that is also why the art book was recently delayed to October 28th. So in summary, what I'm thinking here based off what we've seen, we are going to get fairly decent Metroid Prime 4 news within a few weeks when we get that next Nintendo Direct. I actually think there's a pretty strong chance that later into the year, there will be a Metroid Prime 4 Direct, and then a couple weeks before the release of Metroid Prime 4, we will see some sort of Nintendo Today app announcement where Metroid Prime 2 and 3 will be shadow dropped on the eShop for Switch 1 and 2, and then we'll see the release of Metroid Prime 4 somewhat close to the release of the art book. I think all this is going to happen within a few weeks of each other. I'm personally hoping Prime 4 comes out in September, but this does have me leaning a little bit later into the year. What do you all think though? Let me know in the comments below. This is AndresRestart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.